We are now going to begin a multi-part unit on the first wave of socialist parties that developed in Latin America during the early 20th century. The following videos are going to focus on three early socialist parties in the southern cone of South America. The Socialist Party of Argentina, which was founded in 1896, the Socialist Party of Uruguay, which coalesced between 1905 and 1910, and the Socialist Workers' Party of Chile, which was founded in 1912. All three of these parties emerged out of a major shift in the scope, goals, and tactics of the organized labor movement. The early labor organizations that first developed in these countries during the mid-19th century took the form of mutual aid societies. These organizations were not really equipped to engage in strikes or collective bargaining, and they had a much more narrow scope. They focused their efforts on providing support and insurance to workers and their families in the face of workplace accidents and unemployment. However, by the 1890s, these mutual aid societies were starting to get displaced by a newer and more combative type of organization known as the Sociedad de Resistencia, or Resistance Society. This was a highly confrontational style of unionism that was grounded in what later became known as anarcho-syndicalism. Their members often described the resistance societies as a weapon that the working class would wield against the bosses, the politicians, and the capitalist system itself. Workers did not have a legally recognized right to collective bargaining in these countries at this time, so the way that the resistance societies pursued their goals was by issuing a set of demands and then going on strike until either those demands were met or the strike was crushed through force. By the opening years of the 20th century, labor strikes had become a very common occurrence in cities like Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Santiago, and Valparaiso. The early socialist parties of Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile emerged as a response to this labor militancy. The activists who found these parties are sympathetic to the resistance society's goals, but they also seek to reorient the labor movement away from anarchism and towards socialism. Each of these parties aspires to become the political representative of the working class and the organized labor movement. However, in terms of how these parties actually formed, these cases represent three very different types of relationship between the party and the movement. Of these three parties, the origins of the Argentine Socialist Party come closest to a sponsorship relationship. While the labor movement in Argentina is predominantly anarchist at this time, there was already a minority socialist strain within the movement by the 1890s. And the socialist labor unions play a leading role in founding the Socialist Party in Argentina. They provide the party with many of its early activists and also the organizational resources that help get the party up and running. By contrast, the Uruguayan Socialist Party develops largely independently from Uruguay's pre-existing socialist labor organizations. As we will see in a later video, Uruguay's socialist labor activists were initially pretty skeptical of this socialist party, and it was not until much later that the party and the labor movement joined forces. The Chilean Socialist Workers' Party represents a third type of party-movement relationship in which the party precedes the movement. Unlike in Argentina and Uruguay, there was not really a coherent socialist labor movement in Chile when the Socialist Workers' Party was founded. And even many of the anarchist labor organizations had just been severely weakened by government repression. However, the emergence of this Socialist Workers' Party does help conjure a new socialist labor movement into existence. The party uses its resources to found new socialist labor unions, and later on, the party infiltrates and seizes control over pre-existing non-socialist labor organizations. Despite their different origins, these three parties face a similar set of strategic dilemmas. Their first dilemma is the classic dilemma of whether the socialist parties should concentrate on reform or revolution. Should the party pursue change from inside the Congress or the cabinet? And can socialism even be achieved through the institutions of bourgeois democracy? Or will the transition to socialism require some sort of constitutional rupture that destroys the bourgeois state and creates a new socialist state in its place? Keep in mind that the Russian Revolution has not happened yet. So when socialists in this context are talking about revolution, they are not necessarily thinking about an insurrection in the style of the October Revolution. This debate over reform versus revolution isn't really about violence versus non-violence or even parliamentarism versus direct action. It is really about whether the transition to socialism requires a constitutional rupture and how big and widespread that rupture would have to be. The Socialist Party's second dilemma is between electoralism and laborism. Should we focus our efforts on electoral campaigning, or should we concentrate on building a strong labor movement? Electoralism and laborism are compatible strategies, and all three of these parties do end up pursuing both strategies simultaneously. But there is still a trade-off. In this context, if the Socialist Party's labor actions become too combative or too disruptive, the party may get banned by the state authorities, and it will be unable to contest elections in the future. On the other hand, a socialist party that is trying to win elections may feel pressured to moderate its platform in a way that might alienate organized labor. Moreover, if the party is electorally successful enough to win positions in the government, it may even become implicated in the government's repression of labor strikes. A third dilemma is about who the party's members and supporters should be. Should we be a purely proletarian party that recruits solely within the industrial working class? Or should we open our doors to all classes and welcome peasants, office employees, and professionals into our ranks? These socialist parties start out assuming that they are going to be primarily proletarian parties. After all, their ideology tells them that they are supposed to concentrate their efforts on the industrial working class, because the proletariat is the class that has both the desire and the strength to overthrow capitalism. However, a major challenge that these early socialist parties encounter in Latin America is that the proletariat is still quite small in South America at this time. These three countries are the most urbanized countries in Latin America, but a majority of their population still lives in rural areas and small towns. These three countries have the best developed manufacturing industries in Latin America by the early 20th century, but as late as the 1920s, the industrial proletariat still accounts for less than 10% of the labor force in Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. Even when you add in other working class groups like miners, dock workers, and construction workers, you still end up with a proletariat that is maybe 20% of the economically active population at most. Having the support of 10 to 20% of the population is not enough to win a presidential election in Latin America, but it might be large enough to build a viable socialist party if that party is able to convince most of the working class to support it. But a second challenge that these socialist parties face is that there is already stiff competition for the hearts and minds of the urban workers in these countries. In early 20th century South America, the anarchists have a big head start over the socialists at organizing the working class. And the anarchist resistance societies are stronger, better organized, and more combative than the socialist organizations could ever hope to be. The socialists also face competition from their right. As we have seen in previous videos, some of the elite parties in these countries transform into reformist parties around the early 20th century. And this is especially true of the UCR of Argentina, the Radical Party of Chile, and the Colorado Party of Uruguay. By the time that the socialist parties emerge, these three elite parties have already started to recruit workers into their ranks. The reformist party's goals are certainly more moderate than the goals of the socialist parties, but unlike the socialists, these elite reformist parties have a more realistic chance of winning political office in the near future. As a result, they are much better positioned than the socialist parties are to implement their policy programs. And so these early socialist parties find themselves squeezed between two big political forces that have a significant head start at organizing the working class. The most radical and anti-capitalist workers tend to be attracted to the anarchist organizations, while the most institutionalist workers prefer to work inside the pre-existing reformist parties in an attempt to push them further to the left. Some workers in these countries do find the socialist parties appealing, but these socialist parties have a pretty hard time winning over much of the working class to their brand of socialism. A third problem that these early socialist parties face in building a working class base is that much of the working class in their countries is not eligible to vote at this time. Chile is one of the last countries in Latin America to extend the right to vote to illiterate voters. While many workers in Chile are literate and can vote, many cannot, and this further constrains the size of the Socialist Party's working class constituency. The Socialist parties in Argentina and Uruguay face a slightly different problem. Many of the members of the industrial working class in these countries are not citizens, and they have no intention of ever becoming citizens. Argentina and Uruguay both experienced enormous waves of European immigration between 1870 and 1920, but much of this immigration is short-term economic migration. Most of these immigrants are not looking to settle in these countries permanently. They are moving to Argentina and Uruguay so that they can earn a higher wage on some sort of ranch or meatpacking plant for a couple of years, and then they intend to return home to Italy, Spain, or Russia. The real irony is that many of these immigrant workers are very ideologically receptive to socialism. They just are not interested in building a socialist party in Argentina or Uruguay specifically. That is not why they came to South America. They are in South America to earn a quick buck and return home to Europe as quickly as possible. Immigrant workers do end up becoming an important constituency for both the Argentine and Uruguayan socialist parties, but these parties are able to attract only a small sliver of the immigrant population. For all of these reasons, the socialist parties in these three countries cannot hope to subsist on proletarian support alone. In order to build a politically significant socialist party, they also have to recruit outside of the proletariat. All three of these parties end up relying on the support of the middle class, including teachers, journalists, office employees, professionals, and even small-scale merchants. These middle-class elements are not as revolutionary as the socialist parties would like, but they are not a reactionary force either. Many middle-class voters in these countries actually like a lot of the things that the socialist parties are offering, including a welfare state, the nationalization of industry, and the democratization of the political system. Middle-class voters expect to benefit from all of these things. They also have the discretionary time to devote to activities like electoral organizing and party building. But there is a cost to relying on middle-class support. The middle-class socialists tend to be more skeptical of the militant style of labor organizing that is popular in these countries at this time. They are wary of the economic disruptions that general strikes cause, and they also tend to get spooked by the violence that often results from these strikes, even when most of that violence is perpetrated by the police. As a result, a socialist party that depends on a primarily middle-class constituency may feel pressured to scale back its involvement in labor organizing in order to keep its white-collar supporters happy. A socialist party that depends heavily on middle-class support may also have to sacrifice its more radical political goals and concentrate instead on the modest social democratic reformism that the middle class is willing to support. As we are going to see in the following videos, these early South American socialist parties handle these dilemmas in a variety of different ways. The Argentine Socialist Party starts out as a mostly working class and laborist party, but after Argentina democratizes in the mid-1910s, the party pivots to an electoralist strategy that is grounded on an increasingly middle-class base. It becomes the most electorally successful socialist party in Latin America through the 1930s, but it falls into a steep and permanent decline by the early 1940s. By contrast, the Uruguayan Socialist Party begins as a primarily electoralist party. It wants to be the party of Uruguayan workers, but it ends up drawing most of its early members and leaders from the middle class rather than the working class. But during the course of the 1910s, the Uruguayan party becomes more successful at recruiting workers, and it also becomes more deeply involved in labor organizing. It essentially diversifies both its base and its political strategy. The Chilean Socialist Workers' Party undergoes the most minor changes in its composition and strategy during the 1910s. The miners of northern Chile are always the party's most important constituency, but its base also includes members of the lower middle class and eventually some manufacturing workers and even rural wage workers. It is also by far the most labor-oriented of these three early socialist parties. The Socialist Workers' Party of Chile becomes slightly more electoralist by the early 1920s, but labor organizing is always its primary focus.